In this video, I will be ranking every game in the TMNT Cowabunga Collection. I'll be honest, I'm not very familiar with the TMNT IP, and I don't think Konami knew what the hell it was either. It wasn't exactly popular in Japan, but that wasn't going to stop Konami from making a kick-ass video game. They wouldn't hold back even if it was for some toys absolutely nobody cares about. Just keep in mind this ranking is from someone that just beat all these games on the Cowabunga Collection for the first time, as they were originally released with no save states or rewind, with very minimal knowledge on the actual franchise.
この作品のファンでもない人が評論するのはあんまり意味がありません。
Shoot! So in last place we have TMNT Tournament Fighters for the Sega Genesis. There was no question about it, this is by far the worst game in the collection. Which is unfortunate since I'm a fan of fighting games and was looking forward to playing this. I just thought the game looks nice. It has nice graphics and is going for the TMNT comic style. But as soon as you play it, you'll realize, well, the gameplay is Street Fighter 1 tier. And if you don't believe this game sucks, all you have to do is play it yourself, because I think you will quickly change your mind. The game's got this weird thing where you can set how high you want your speed and power to be. I don't know who thought that would be a good idea to put in the game. It's almost like they put it in the game so they didn't have to balance characters at all. It's like, oh, you think your favorite character sucks? We'll just increase their power or speed, I guess. But surprisingly, I thought this stat thing just doesn't really change the game a whole lot. If you're a pro gamer like me, you just pick April and put them through the April blender. This game pretty much doesn't have combos, which isn't immediately a bad thing, but rounds will frequently take only 2 to 3 hits to end. This game is just not fun at all and is easily one of the worst fighting games I've ever played. The artist did a good job with it, but the designers just clearly did not care at all. And despite being on the Sega Genesis, it somehow managed to be worse than the next game. Next we got TMNT Tournament Fighters on the NES, and yes, this is genuinely better than the Genesis game. But it's still not good. One of the few genres the Game Boy outshines the NES in by a lot is the fighting game genre. The Game Boy actually has some pretty good fighting games. The NES, not so much. Though I have to admit, I still need to play Joy Mech Fight. This game looks kind of crazy. But I can't be too hard on this game when it's still miles ahead of other fighting games on NES. For example, Yi Ar Kung Fu, which is actually also a Konami game. So this game, while shallow, is still better than almost all fighting games on the system. But of course, this game has the advantage of being made 10 years later in 1994, which was the last year NES and Famicom games were still being released. I just didn't enjoy it too much, and I've played much more impressive fighting games on a different 8-bit system, the Game Boy. Speaking of the Game Boy, next is TMNT 3 Radical Rescue for the Game Boy. So this game is pretty interesting as it is a Konami Metroidvania that predates Symphony of the Night. How much of an influence did it actually have on the game? I'm not quite sure, possibly none. As far as Metroidvanias go, this one is incredibly bare bones, and uses a password system instead of saving with 2 continues, and then you game over. What the heck? You're telling me they couldn't have saving like in Metroid 2 that came out 2 years prior? You'll have to frequently keep track of different passwords which you randomly get as you explore different areas. I just didn't find the game very fun or interesting to explore, which is kind of important for the genre, as you want players to be curious and to want to see more. The different abilities you need to progress come from the different turtles you rescue. Leonardo's ability, for example, has no other use other than to be able to get to areas you can't get to otherwise if you don't have them, so he's useless to play as outside of that. Donatello and Michelangelo have the most useful abilities by far, especially for boss fights. But one thing that annoyed me is that all the turtles have shared health, unlike TMNT on NES where each of your turtles have their own health bar, which means that there's even less of a reason to play as Leonardo. And actually, believe it or not, I find this game to be way harder than TMNT on NES and easily the hardest game of the collection. This is thanks to the boss rush at the end. You have to get through every boss in the game to even be able to attempt Shredder. If you die once, you have to fight every boss over again. This wouldn't be so bad if you could hit the bosses for more than 1 damage at a time. And on top of that, the bosses have a lot of invincibility after getting hit, so no matter how much you've mastered each boss fight, it's going to take a while no matter what. And while you hit the bosses for a maximum of 1 damage, they can do 4 damage to you in 1 hit. Kind of bullshit if you ask me. Well, it's certainly the most ambitious of the TMNT Game Boy games, and most people would tell you it's the best of the 3. For me, it's my least favorite. TMNT Fall of the Foot Clan. This is the first game in this video I genuinely enjoy, which means I like 10 out of 13 games in this collection, which makes it a damn good collection. First thing I'll point out is that this is possibly the best looking game released in the first 2 years of the Game Boy's lifespan. The price to pay for the impressive graphics was unfortunately making the game very slow to play. To make the game engaging, they have enemies pop up at you constantly throughout the game, which admittedly is very repetitive, but it's hard to say that it's unengaging. There are 4 different turtles to play as, but they don't actually play any different from each other, which is unfortunate. This game is also very short and very easy, but it's a fun half an hour to spend. It also has one of the most pathetically easy final bosses I've seen in any game. At number 9 is TMNT 2 Back from the Sewers, which is easily my favorite out of the Game Boy trilogy. I found this game is a lot less repetitive than the previous game, which is mostly thanks to its variety and level design, and honestly its gameplay is kind of unique compared to most games in the collection. It's not extremely easy like the first game, or stupidly hard like the third. It's a decent challenge on normal, but you can select a higher difficulty if you want. It's still a bit too slow for my liking, but it's a good time overall. You might be surprised that this game has a larger file size than TMNT 3 by quite a bit, and I think that's due to the voice clips that are surprisingly high quality for the Game Boy. Not sure why they felt the need to prioritize that over anything else in the game, but they did. TMNT 2, the arcade game, was Konami's attempt at bringing the TMNT arcade experience to the NES. Realistically though, the game couldn't have been quite as fast with as many enemies on screen at a time with this hardware. And it goes without saying that the NES version is only 2-player co-op rather than 4 like the arcade. The game plays a bit differently. In this game I find myself spamming the attack where you press A and B together, which is very reliable because it kills all the basic enemies in one hit. Surprisingly, it doesn't drain your health either. The presentation and music are excellent for the system. And while Konami could have gotten away with only putting the stages that appear from the arcade game in, they went out of their way to not only extend the length of these stages, but they also added 2 brand new stages that are exclusive to this version, which means there's actually more content here than in the arcade version, as it's not simply an inferior conversion, so it stands on its own as a worthwhile experience. Next is the game that started it all, TMNT for the arcade. Okay, it didn't really start at all, but you know what I mean. This is actually the only game in the collection I played before owning the collection. As a pizza place I went to had a cabinet, because where else would you expect to see it? Although then I didn't have enough quarters to actually finish it. Like I said, it has less content than the NES game, but the game looks better, feels better to control, and overall there's more action able to be on screen at a time. Even though this game is quite simple even compared to other TMNT games, how could you go wrong with it? This was possibly the best arcade beat 'em up ever released at the time, whether you're a fan of this franchise or not. I just love how fast it feels. I just prefer the feel of this game compared to something like Final Fight, which came out just a month later. I just happen to like 6 games in this collection even more, but really not much I can complain about for this game. Next is the actual game that started it all, the first TMNT game ever made. It was a huge success and is the reason why all the other games exist. It also has a reputation for being one of the most difficult video games of all time, which may be the reason IGN ranked it as the absolute worst game of the collection. In my opinion, the hate this game gets is not really deserved. The truth is, this is the best-selling non-Nintendo NES game. Everyone and their mom has played it. Konami developed games in general were harder than Nintendo developed games. And this game is definitely arguably the hardest of the best-selling NES games. At least of the top 15 best-selling. But if you're considering all NES games, this one's actually pretty forgiving. You essentially have 4 different health bars that are easy to heal back up if you leave and re-enter an area that has pizza. Everyone always complains about the underwater section and the sewer level, but honestly I didn't struggle with these parts at all. With the sewer level, you just have to know what your 3 different jumps are. The only part of this game I would consider hard is the final level, which is actually kind of absurdly difficult. The final level exposes the 2 things that I consider this game's biggest problems. And that is 1, that Donatello is way more useful than the other turtles, and 2, enemy encounter RNG. Basically with the 3 turtles that aren't Donatello, it's not even worth fighting the enemies. They simply can't kill them without dying. You're better off trying to avoid them, taking the least amount of damage possible. And as for the enemy encounters, just pray the astronaut doesn't show up that often. They're very hard to avoid and do a stupid amount of damage. While I said the other turtles are useless here, you'll still want to use them for their health bars so you can conserve Donatello. Because if he dies, you may as well give up on this level. A lot of people recommend farming the scrolls before attempting this level, but I advise against it, since if you die you lose all your scrolls, or you can accidentally pick up a different weapon. Farming scrolls I feel like is just a complete waste of time. Just try your best to survive making it to Shredder, as the Shredder fight itself is a complete joke. Oh, I almost forgot to say what I like about this game. I think it's fun. Super Nintendo got Turtles in Time, while Sega Genesis got the Hyperstone Heist. This game shares a lot of similarities with Turtles in Time and is a very solid game, but isn't quite on the same level of quality. Turtles in Time I felt used the Super Nintendo's hardware to its fullest, but it doesn't feel the same can be said about this game and the Sega Genesis. Even though there's plenty of Konami games I felt used the Genesis hardware to its fullest. It just feels like the game is kind of rushed. There's only 5 stages in the game. These stages are just stretched out to be longer, but one of the stages is just reused boss fights. It's a very fun game, I just can't help but feel like it could have been even better if the developers were given more time. At number 4 is the legendary Turtles in Time Arcade, an improvement over the original arcade Turtles in every way. Bosses, stages, music, overall game feel, and this may have even ranked higher if it wasn't for the SNES Turtles in Time. The truth is, there isn't much of a reason for me to revisit this game. And that's because I'd rather just play the Super Nintendo version, which managed to be even better than this game. I said the original Turtles arcade may be the best arcade beat-em-up ever released at the time, but this game is probably the best arcade beat-em-up ever released, period. And you don't gotta be a Turtles fan to think that, you just have to play the game. At number 3 is TMNT 3 The Manhattan Project, a game that can feel criminally overlooked only because it's a later NES release. It might be shocking to see an NES Turtles game ranking higher than Turtles in Time Arcade, but I'd revisit this game more often as there isn't some version of this game that's better. This game only exists on NES, and I also feel it's the best an NES beat-em up could possibly get. My favorite thing about this game is the Turtles' special moves. They all have their own unique special move that differentiates the Turtles from one another, while in other games the Turtles can feel almost identical when it comes to their gameplay. These special moves are useful for different situations and you'll be thinking about which works best for a specific boss. But also comes down to personal preference. It is incredibly satisfying to land these hits on bosses when they're vulnerable for massive damage. These special moves of course decrease your health upon using them, but what I like is that when you have 1 health left, you can start spamming these attacks. If you're a speedrunner, you'll be essentially playing the entire game on 1 health, which I think makes things quite interesting. In a lot of other beat-em-ups, they don't let you use these sorts of attacks when you have 1 health left, but this game lets you play very risky for the entire time and be rewarded for it. The music and graphics for this game are of course top-notch, and I would say the difficulty level is near perfect. This game is actually very challenging. I would say it's the 3rd most challenging in the collection, but it never feels unfair or impossible. You'll have to dedicate time to learning it and getting good at the game, which makes it feel all the more satisfying when you finally beat it. And it helps that the game is fun, which will make you want to keep coming back after game over. At number 2, TMNT Tournament Fighters for SNES. I had very low expectations going into this game because before I played the not very good Genesis and NES versions, but it turns out I think I actually prefer this game over every Super Nintendo Street Fighter 2 that's not the new challengers. And surprisingly, the characters don't come off as clones of Street Fighter 2's character archetypes. The 12 playable characters support a wide range of playstyles and to me feel a million times more balanced than the Genesis game. I also like that the game offers a normal speed or a turbo speed. I always pick turbo. It also has 2 different game modes, the story mode and tournament mode. I'm not sure why, but story mode doesn't have super moves, but I'm very okay with that. You might be able to tell that the presentation is superb. Unlike the other tournament fighter games, what's crazy is that this game still has active players in tournaments even to this day. So while I'm a very casual player, it seems like other people think it's good enough and fun enough to play competitively in the year 2022. Number 1 probably comes as a surprise to absolutely no one, and that is TMNT 4 Turtles in Time for Super Nintendo. Like TMNT 2, the arcade game on NES, they could have simply done a conversion of the arcade game, but they actually try and make improvements, making it the superior of the 2. And as I said earlier, they use the SNES hardware capabilities to its fullest, which can be seen here with the Neon Knight Rider stage using Mode 7 sprite scaling. They also turn the highly satisfying act of throwing your enemies at the camera into a meaningful gameplay mechanic. In the arcade version it just looked cool, but here you have to throw enemies at Shredder showing his perspective, which is legitimately one of the most creative boss fights I've seen. The game also has new boss fights that weren't present in the arcade game. And maybe it's just me, but the controls and responsiveness feel superior to the arcade game as well. Basically, Konami took an already great game and managed to make it even better, and it undoubtedly deserves the number 1 spot. To me, it's still the peak of the TMNT game series even to this day, and that's gonna be the end of my ranking. I'd be interested to see yours, so feel free to reveal it in the comments.